Hello, everyone. Welcome today. I'm Dr. Builder. I'm a senior researcher here at the Oxford Internet Institute and project manager for Fairer Project. To everybody online and in the room, welcome to Digital Knowledge Exchange within Africa's innovation ecosystem. What is happening in Lagos? We're delighted to have Dr. Raymond Onuoha with us today to discuss the knowledge development process concerning the Lagos digital innovation ecosystem. Raymond Onuoha is a technology policy scholar and consultant. He's currently an AFOX fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute and a postdoctoral fellow at the Wits Institute of Social and Economic Research, South Africa. Raymond's research, consulting and teaching focuses on the institutional and policy challenges in the evolution of the digital economy and technology innovation in developing countries with a specialization on Africa. He also works as a research consultant within regional ICT policy and regulation think tanks, Research ICT Africa, South Africa, IT for Change, and Portland's Institute. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and it will be posted online on our website following the event. The presentation will run about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by a discussion at the end. If you're joining us online, please put your questions into the Q&A box, and those in the room, save your questions until the end, and Raymond will answer them after the talk. If you wish to ask questions with your microphone or camera on, please raise your hand during the Q&A session and we will call on you. Be aware that this will be included in the final recording. It's great to have you here, Raymond, and I'll now hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Wanda. And thank you for coming to listen to my talk. My name is Raymond, and I'm a postdoc fellow at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research based in Johannesburg, South Africa. And my work in the past 5 years has focused on institutional and policy issues around technology innovation and evolution, especially within emerging country contexts, with a specific focus on African ecosystems. But more specifically in this talk, I want to share some work in progress of some issues and reflections that we're assessing with particular respect to digital knowledge exchange as it is happening within Africa's fledgling or nascent knowledge digital ecosystems. This is a broader work that will look at the key hubs in Africa, Lagos, of course. Charity, they say, begins at home, Lagos in Nigeria, and then Cape Town, where I'm based in South Africa. Then we'll look at Cairo as well, beyond the sub-Saharan African space. And finally, within East African bloc, we'll look at Nairobi in Kenya. But the first phase of this work is looking at what is happening with respect to knowledge exchange, in particular respect with the Lagos innovation ecosystem. And that is some of the foundations and reflections that I'll be sharing in this talk. Like I said, very much not a completed work. And so it gives me the privilege talking to this very brilliant cohort, and especially those who have joined online, to get your thoughts, to get your reflections, your comments at the end of the presentation, to move the work forward in terms of completing of the research in this respect. So let me just go in. So this is the basic conceptual frame that is underpinning my reflection and assessment in this respect with regards to knowledge exchange and linkages within ecosystem. So based on a work that has been championed from Oxford here, the Global Innovation Index that has been on, I think, since 2014, and been led by Professor Bruno Lavin, as well as the Dean of Side Business School, Professor Sumichiro Tuta. I think they have led that work, the Global Innovation Index. And based on the longitudinal data from the GII for over almost 13 years now, the consensus at the moment with respect to the performance of innovation ecosystems based on the more recent work of Costa Cavalcante, just this year, that of Bete in 2023, Bete et al., as well as some years past, Kuramoto and Sagasti, as well as Grandinetti in 2011. The consensus from looking at this longitudinal data with respect to ecosystem performance is that a very significant, a very critical predictor of how innovation ecosystems perform is the level of knowledge exchange and linkages within particular clusters within ecosystems. But these do not happen in isolation, and their performances are very synchronic with the particular peculiar institutional context where these things are happening or where they occur. And so this forms the key conceptual frame that is guiding my thinking in the assessment looking at these ecosystem hubs across Africa with respect to their knowledge exchange and linkages. And so when you look at that beyond the scholarly domain and you begin to extrapolate that on the praxis angle, especially from a developing country context, if you look within the emerging ecosystems in developing country economies, the knowledge base, especially from a contemporary perspective, is not homogeneous in that it consists, maybe in contrast to more developed ecosystems, it consists both of indigenous knowledge and, more importantly, of foreign knowledge as well. So the development of knowledge, of the knowledge base within these ecosystems is not automatic, considering the heterogeneity within those knowledge domains. And so what you find out is that because of this level of heterogeneity in comparison to more developed ecosystems, the kinds of innovation that emanate from those kinds of hubs are basically more incremental rather than radical in terms of the kinds of innovative products and services that begin to occur from those knowledge bases in that respect. So when you bring that down to Africa, of course, in the last decade, there have been an emergence typifying of what is happening in the global order of technology hubs. But again, you begin to ask, regardless of the potential, the possibilities of what the solutions that these local hubs that are springing up are bringing to the table in trying to solve some of the peculiar constraints within those contexts, social, economic issues, and all in respect to technology products and services. Regardless of those potentials, there have not been significant scaling. Of course, that is established both in literature and in practice. There have not been significant scaling of those kinds of products and services beyond even their local markets. And much more, when you begin to look at that in the global context, it pales almost, their efforts pale almost into oblivion in that. So potency in that respect does not necessarily equate to their capacity to scale. And so based on this chart or this data from KPMG Global Innovation Survey last year, asking which countries are showing the most promise for disruptive technology breakthroughs that will have significant global impacts. Of course, as expected, United States, 26% of that potential, China, 25%, India, from an emerging country context, as strong as 11%. In United Kingdom, about 10%. And so for Africa, if it's constituting less than 2%, this does not sum up to 100. So Africa is part of the remaining block in terms of their potential to scale from the significant effects of the kinds of products and services that are emanating from their own ecosystems. And so based on this void, the key problem for me is what kinds of alternate aggregations of knowledge development are there for integrating these kinds of indigenous knowledge that exists in these ecosystems with foreign capabilities in the evolution of the digital ecosystems within those contexts. And so that becomes the key question, the key problem that I'm looking at in that respect and guiding my thoughts. So when we bring it down to what is happening in the Lagos digital innovation ecosystem. And so there are two pictures here. And so just to get our thoughts, if you look at these two different pictures, what are you seeing? If I may ask, what are you seeing? I'd like to get maybe some feedback on what we're seeing.
What's an enterprise?
What?
Enterprise.
Enterprise? Okay, great. Okay.
One of them looks like a very colorful market.
Colorful market, okay.
Yeah.
And the other one is what?
It's like a normal city center.
Okay, in normal city center. All right, so you know, so I want to hear from you. Okay, what do you think?
I like the colorful market.
Okay, colorful market, entrepreneurial. Okay, I'll pick on the entrepreneurial aspect because these two pictures are the geolocational domains, geolocational base of whatever is happening within the Lagos digital innovation ecosystem. So whatever you've been hearing about all the different unicorns that may have come up from the Lagos ecosystem of whatever technology product and services or whatever buzz or hype that you're hearing with respect to the innovation ecosystem in Lagos, these two pictures represent the geolocational basis of whatever is happening there, constituting more than 90% of whatever is going on within the Lagos ecosystem with respect to innovation. There are two clusters here. One is the Otiba cluster, and the other on my right is the Yaba cluster. I'll go a little deeper in what is happening with respect to knowledge exchange within these clusters to shed some light on the dynamics that are evolving. And what does imperatives mean for the long-term evolution and sustainability of these ecosystems? Basically, these two, what is driving them, as you can see even from the energy of the picture, and much more from the Otiba cluster, is the key elements that is driving them is entrepreneurship. So what you can see there is basically in the parlance, in the local parlance, you can say hustle. It is basically anchored on hustle. So from a theoretical perspective, if we want to contrast that, for example, to Silicon Valley, that is much more formalized, much more advanced, just to show some contrast, these two, before the likes of Silicon Valley came into operation from a theoretical perspective, you have, okay, at the most fundamental, you had the triple helix model, okay? There are very significant academic institutions, the Stanfords, the UC Berkeley's, the University of California in San Francisco. There was very strong government support. There were already an industrial base, the Apples, the Facebooks, the IBMs, all of them were already domiciled before the takeoff of the Silicon base and may have contributed because from a theoretical perspective, those are the key tripod that must fundamentally be in place and work interrelationship to drive any kinds of innovation and evolution that will be strong or have some significant scale in the long term with respect to the evolution of any ecosystem. But for these ecosystems, not really standing on any particular tripod, but perhaps on one or two, as I will explain further. But suffice that to say that entrepreneurial drive is the key underpinning factor that is driving whatever innovation activities that is happening within this cluster. So let me go to the Otiba Tech cluster to drive in a little bit more about the history, the evolution, and the dynamics of what is happening in this space. So like you said, colorful market. So in this context, with respect to this evolution, if you go there and say this is a tech cluster, the operators here will not really understand what you're saying, but much more synonymous to what is known as the computer village, much more like a village that deals with computer accessory sales. And these were anchored, the entrepreneurial drive here was anchored on the industrial evolution that began to happen in Nigeria. Of course, when Lagos was still the capital of the country in the 1980s, between the 1980s and the very early 1990s. Okay, by 1991, Abuja has become the capital of Nigeria. And so was founded on the industrial district in the capital of Lagos in Ikeja. And so when we talk of the triple helix model, you have academia, you have government, you have industries at the base. But for this tech cluster, mostly the entrepreneurial drive there was mostly anchored on the industrial capability and capacity within the Ikeja hub in Lagos. And so they were the industries that were beginning to emerge there. They were servicing the mainframes. As we moved from mainframes to laptops, as an informal market, self-organized without any significant institutional support or government plan or support in its evolution. And so it got to its peak in the late 1990s with the emergence of the mobile revolution. Of course, very significant as a key platform interface for most African ecosystems. The mobile revolution was a critical key point in terms of most of the evolutions in these systems. And so it got at the peak in the late 1990s with the mobile revolution, moving from single store operator businesses to currently much more than about 5,000 operators, but again, mostly informal, as you can see from this picture, non-structured, but the annual revenues from these kinds of engagement and whatever that is happening in this ecosystem on an annual basis beyond $2 billion in revenues. That might not make too much sense when you compare that to what is happening in much more developed ecosystems. But if you contrast this to even the general or the total GDPs of these ecosystems, this becomes very significant, coming just from this geolocational domain. And they are serving not just the domestic market, they're also serving the neighboring West African ecosystem in that sense. So this is about the evolution of Otigba Tech Cluster. But if you come with respect to what is happening in the knowledge development and linkages and exchanges, typically it's a closed system. If you begin to align that to what the scholarship talks about with regards to ecosystem structures and all, it's basically a closed system with respect to how they engage with foreign ecosystems in relation to digital capabilities and digital knowledge in that sense. So I will explain a little bit more on how that happens. So basically through on-the-job apprenticeship, and so comprising mostly indigenous knowledge and some tacit knowledge that, again, by firm level capability that are tacit, reverse engineering, they pick up some of these computer artifacts, they pick up some of these machines, tear it open, try to find out what is happening just by on-the-job learning, reverse engineering, imitation, adaptation, and in their own sense, maybe cloning. And so a lot of cloning markets serving those local market as well as West African adjacent markets that are close by. And then from a knowledge perspective, here on the right here, this is the computer village. The pointer is not working, but on the red there, that's a computer village from a Google map here showing that there's an academic institution that was established in the 1990s. But like I said, the structure here is typically closed. And so relationship, knowledge exchanges with respect to engaging external intermediaries is almost to a zero. And so the minimal influence of this polytechnic beyond just training of some technology graduates and all, but again, the kinds of knowledge that is coming out from these kinds of institutions, if you contrast that to what is required in operation in your computer village, a lot of mismatches. And so mostly and largely non-relevant from a knowledge development perspective with regards to the Otigba cluster. So when we move to the Yaba cluster, much more recent, the Otigba cluster, like I said, the entrepreneurial hustle there is anchored on the industrial base of the area. For this Yaba Tech cluster, remember again, we are explaining this in contrast to what the fundamental requirements are from a Trimpo Hellis perspective. This is a startup revolution, of course, in the early 2000s with the emergence of global startups, globalization effects, of course, mimicking those kinds of impact within the Lagos ecosystem. The Yaba Tech Cluster evolved within that startup revolution in Nigeria in the late 2000s. And its own entrepreneurial hustle was anchored on the very relevant and proximate academic institutions. There was the University of Lagos, domiciled within that cluster. There was also the less popular Yaba College of Technology, and also the Nigerian Medical Research Institute, all technology-intensive academic institutions. But as I will explain, these institutions are not necessarily playing the key role of technology transfer agents in relation with foreign ecosystems. And then that produces a gap that I'll talk about in terms of what is happening with respect to their evolution. Much more semi-formal, if you compare that to, if you contrast that to Otiba, of course, much more semi-formal, even though there are also some informal businesses that are operating within this context with regards to the structured economic apparatus of the Nigerian ecosystem in that sense. So a bit more formal than Otiba. In terms of their size, less than 10 tech startups from their initial phases in 2013, they have grown currently to more than 100. Of course, at 100, if you contrast that to Silicon Valley, thousands of companies, but even within these ecosystems, at least they have produced up to 5 unicorns in that sense. But even at 100, very much a less dense ecosystem structure, and that has imperatives in terms of the kinds of knowledge exchanges that is possible within those kinds of ecosystems. They are servicing mainly the local domestic market. This has very significant correlation to the persistent weak technological capabilities. As I said, the academic institutions, even though they are much more engaging, this is a much more open system, as I'll make mention as I go forward. Even though the academic institutions here are playing a stronger role in contrast to what we saw in the Otiba Tech cluster, with respect to supporting knowledge engagement within this cluster, they are still not playing the critical role of bridging that ecosystem knowledge interaction between the local cluster and foreign innovation ecosystems. That's even when we consider light touch institutional support, you can see better infrastructure here with respect to roads, network, and what have you. So a bit much more semi-formal in contrast to Otiba. But again, this void with respect to technology transfer led the space for the emergence of collaboration networks and institutions. Being less closed than the Otiba cluster is a much more open ecosystem structure in that sense. So if in Yaba cluster, you have currently more than 40 innovation hubs that are intermediating knowledge exchange between the local and foreign ecosystems. But again, what they are focusing on key within these kinds of hubs, of course, the more popular co-creation hub, as well as Andela, but their focus remains at the level of incubation. That means building on the primary innovative ideas that the operators there are bringing to the table, and then provide some funds here and there to accelerate their market expansion and what have you. So incubation and acceleration remains their key focus with respect to what the collaboration networks here are implementing. But in terms of technology transfer within the foreign and local ecosystems, still persistently weak. And this was a major issue institutionally why the federal government in Nigeria set up the NOTA. Since 1979, the Nigerian Office for Technology Acquisition in that sense. But the effectiveness still very weak. And of course, it is the weakness of these, the institutional government, the public institutional NOTAP that gave some more petulance to the operations of these collaboration networks in this sense. So the jury is still out there in terms of their performance, but with respect to technology transfer, still very weak in that sense. So if you make a contrast of what is happening, the influence of their clustering dynamics with respect to the knowledge exchanges happening within these two key clusters within the Lagos innovation ecosystem, because see for Yaba, weak knowledge cooperation, what is driving that? A key issue that we found was the macro implications of this, of course, very much reliant on intermediaries, local orchestrators like Co-Creation Hub and Andela that I showed earlier within that cluster. But a key weakness here is that these local orchestrators are very much highly dependent on the Silicon Valley-based institutions. Of course, on the onset of the Yaba cluster around the mid-2000s. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg was in the Yaba cluster. He invested like $24 million then, especially in Andela. And then in collaboration with CC Hub as well, they set up the NG Hub, which became like the critical nozzle for technology transfer and knowledge exchange within the Yaba cluster. But again, as the economy of Nigeria began to nosedive towards even the 2019s, just before the onset of COVID, of course, COVID made everything more difficult in terms of institutional support from these foreign operators, which the local orchestrators are heavily reliant on with respect to their technology transfer efforts. Facebook, they stepped back from their support of the NG Hub around 2021. Of course, Andela as well, a part of that project around 2020. They've already closed down all their local offices in Lagos, and their focus on technology transfer much more insignificant at the moment, much more focused on professional, senior, experienced talent in supporting even foreign ecosystems in that sense. So this problem has still not been solved. Considering also the current weak institutional support, these ecosystems are still at the moment, because of these gaps, completely efficiency driven, just for the production of innovative services, products in that sense. The knowledge-driven capability is still very weak in that sense. And so overall, from an ecosystem structure scholarship domain, you would say that the Yaba has an open, diffuse structure. Of course, just about 100 players within that geolocational domain, very sparse, very diffuse, but much more open, relying heavily on intermediaries, local orchestrators in the management of knowledge exchanges between its local structure and the foreign ecosystems in that sense. And so you would say for Yaba, the existence of weak ties is very replete there. In contrast to Otiba, much more direct tacit knowledge exchange in relation to foreign ecosystems through spillover effects of franchising, licensing, cooperative production agreements, reverse engineering, like I talked about earlier, imitation, cloning, direct hands-on in terms of how they are able to transmit tacit knowledge exchanges with foreign ecosystems. And instead of relying on external local orchestrators, what they measure is through their own trade association. There is a CAPDAN, the Association of Computers and Allied Products Dealer Association of Nigeria, that is domiciled in the Otiba cluster, okay? The leveraging of these, they are their own members, internal to them. And so because of that internal dimension, the propensity for easier assimilation, adaptation, application of foreign capabilities within the local business context is more imperative in this cluster. And so for overall, for the Otiba cluster, you say is a close-knit structure. Within that, more than 5,000 businesses, dense structure, very close-knit. You say the existence of strong ties in that sense. So overall, in contrast, the level of knowledge development and diffusion relatively much stronger in the more closed Otiba cluster, if you contrast that to the more open Yaba cluster. Secondly, the open structure of the Yaba cluster allows for novelty regardless of the deficiencies there. It allows for novelty in the creation and exchange of more innovative, more diverse and codifiable technology knowledge across ecosystems, in contrast to the more tacit knowledge exchange dynamics that's happening in Otiba. Of course, codifiable technology knowledge exchange does not require normative levels of trust among members that is domiciled within closed-knit structures such as in Otiba. But these kinds of phenomenon very requisite for new product development. But like I said, nothing very much scaled, just efficiency-driven instead of high-level knowledge-driven, not producing artifacts or products or services that scale even beyond their own local markets or even the global markets in those extents. So overall, Yaba cluster has still thus remained the leading cluster for some kinds of high-tech innovation. High-tech in relation to TIWA, not really in relation to global ecosystems within the Lagos technology ecosystem. And so for me, looking at those backgrounds, the overriding or emerging research questions for me, what kinds of effective, considering all the contextual issues that I've raised prior, what kinds of effective mechanisms are there, are possibilities for integrating local indigenous knowledge with foreign capabilities in the evolution of Africa's digital entrepreneurial ecosystem to enable these emergent products and services that you're showing to be able to scale globally. I showed earlier the example of Silicon Valley in that sense. So what kinds of possible mechanisms are there? I'd like to get our thoughts, our comments based on the issues that I've raised here, whatever questions that you might have. And I'll stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Raymond, for this oversight. For those of you online, please add your questions into the Q&A box, and I will share it with Raymond here. And for those of you who are in the room, the floor is now open for questions and comments. If there are no burning questions, perhaps I can start. You mentioned quite a bit the weak ties and strong ties. Is this from the Granovetter's strong? Okay. Yeah. Could you tell us a bit more about how Granovetter's theory then is really sort of shaping this technological innovation space? And are you also seeing sort of strengths of the weak ties or the weakness of the strong ties? How does this really relate to your work?
Okay, that's a very relevant question. And that is, of course, the kinds of assessment that we provide some direction in terms of possibilities with regards to optimizing these kinds of ecosystems. What do we do with the kinds of these dynamics that is happening within the Lagos innovation ecosystem? And so in a particular dimension based on Granovetter, there is weak ties happening. And for him, he thinks that for optimizing the ecosystem performance, now weak ties are even much more stronger. But again, the constraint in that sense is that the kinds of knowledge exchange there is weaker, as we can see from DOT, but it's much more stronger in a dense, a little bit in contrast to what Granovetter is saying, considering our own institutional context. So while the weak ties for our own unique context, remember from the conceptual framework, the institutional context is very important to understand what the dynamics are play. So in a little bit contrast to what Granovetter is saying, the weak ties here has their own pros, but it also has its own cons in terms of the kinds of knowledge, even though the weak ties enable us for innovative technology knowledge extrapolations, it is not significant for the long term because of the dynamics of the dependence of foreign ecosystems here. So if the dependence on foreign ecosystems in terms of institutional support is a weakness in this sense, how do we optimize these kinds of evolution? Then in this sense, that becomes a key question for me. Because if you look at your TIBA, okay, is a close-knit strong tie. And based on what we are seeing, there is a higher, stronger level of knowledge exchange. The only constraint is that the kinds of knowledge exchanges, they are not novel because it's relying more on the indigenous and relying more on tacit kinds of knowledge. But again, you need the foreign capabilities if you want to create something that can scale even globally. So the question now becomes, based on this context, how do you optimize? Having both the weak ties in place in this ecosystem, we have weak tie dynamics, we have strong tie dynamics. What kinds of integrations are possible in trying to optimize this ecosystem? Well, that is the key question, and that is what I want to get our thoughts for in that respect.
It sounds like a really interesting question, and I do hear the broader institutional aspect that is also related for your research. We have one question from Nicholas, and they're asking, considering there isn't always a very strong government input within the innovation process, what can other two areas of the Helix model do to accelerate and optimize innovation?
So there's a weak institutional support. For me, if there is a weak institutional support, you can't wish that away. It's based on the triple helix model. It is important that those three tripods must be in place if you're going to be able to create any scalable level innovation. So government has to be there, the support has to be there. The academic support we see is very strong with respect to Yaba. We see the industrial base is strong with respect to Otiba. How do we begin to merge these to at least make sure that we have two in place? And then this government support from a policy recommendation perspective is critical. Otherwise, they are only going to remain constrained within their local market. It will be difficult to scale it. You can't wish that away. You can't have alternatives, except you have some that you want to propose. But based on what is established in literature, you can't wish that away. That is important. There must be some kinds of defined policy support, institutional support to enable these kinds of ecosystems to scale. Otherwise, it's not possible. In particular, the key constraint that ties these two clusters together, which is a weakness in their technology transfer system. And so issues around intellectual property, technology transfer frameworks and structures become very critical. And then governments within these kinds of contexts must begin to take those serious. Otherwise, they will just keep revolving within their local markets and have very insignificant capacities to scale any of their products and services globally in their engagement with foreign ecosystems and capabilities in that sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. We don't
I have one. I have one.
yes, no, thank you. I was just going to say we don't have one online, so I was going to offer it to the floor. Thank you so much.
So Raymond, you mentioned the foreign capabilities. I would like to understand how you see the tensions with big international companies, because sometimes you can have this knowledge transfer, but on the other hand, these companies can act as gatekeepers. So if we look, for instance, at digital platforms, when you talk about the app market or social media or e-commerce platforms as well. So how do you see a tension in that? Do you see these like international large companies, technology companies and information companies acting more as enablers or more as one of the constraints that the national Legos ecosystem face when they're trying to scale up, as you mentioned?
Yeah, like I said earlier, these foreign capabilities within emerging country context or with respect to the innovation ecosystems, it's a critical component of their contemporary knowledge base. So it's heterogeneous, regardless of whatever indigenous. In terms of global knowledge production, the foreign element is critical for them if they are going to create any kinds of scalable innovation with respect to their products and services. In this case, there are tensions. What we are seeing at the moment is that the foreign ecosystems are leveraging the operators in these local markets basically for market access. So what we see, okay, using the example of Facebook, for example, so we can see that the kinds of partnerships that they have in setting up the NG Hub was not sustainable in the long run. So when there's an economic downturn where they can't really make significant upsides in terms of their investments, they pull back. So it's just about investment driven, economic driven, and not at a partnership level. Okay, do we really want to transfer skills to these people? Even though when you look at the Otiba cluster, for example, they are gleaning these things from more direct representations, either through franchising, either through imitation, reverse engineering and stuff, trying to replicate whatever is done in this foreign country directly by themselves. But in bridging these kinds of tension within particular contexts, there is where institutional support becomes very critical. So these guys cannot design frameworks that will compel technology transfer within the engagements with these foreign partners in that sense. And so that is where there needs to be some kind of step up from an institutional perspective, create frameworks within these kinds of, what kinds of mechanisms do you put in place so that as they are engaging economically, technology is being transferred in those sense. Otherwise, at the end of the day, everybody has their own incentive, but it takes governments to bridge those incentives and create more sustainable outcomes for them in their relationships with the foreign ecosystems in that sense.
You have a question, please?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Raymond. I have two questions. I was just wondering that will you have the chance to um, to make contact with those who are on the ground, the actors within this post-split, and maybe is it possible they could share their thoughts on how their story of evolution, that's one, and also what are their strategies of competing well enough at the global scale? That's just one question. And then also, is it possible in the absence of government support that these ecosystems can thrive on the global market? Because you did acknowledge that there's no government support, but in a situation where they don't even get support at all, can they still break through?
Let me just start with the second one. With what is known from the scholarly domain, it's impossible. Like I said, very related questions related to what the person has. It's very impossible, except you are providing new theories or new perspective to deal with these kinds of issues. Fundamentally, they are the kinds of engagements have even moved from triple helix to quad to quintuple and all that. But at the basic, if you looked at how the prior ones from the history has emerged and become globally sustainable and scalable in those sense, government support is critical in relation to academic enterprises, in relation to industrial capacities. So based on what is known, it's impossible for them to thrive without it. So there must be some kind of strong government support in driving those kinds of engagement. And that government support is critical, especially when there are competing interests. Of course, everybody will fight for their own incentives. So within context, in terms of balancing those kind of dynamics, those government support becomes very critical. Actors sharing their thoughts, of course, I've been in touch with some of them already, but in terms of scaling, what you get from them is that they have resented to fate. They can't really do much, or they are thinking they really don't have any global scaling ambitions. But again, what can we do? And that is the crux of the research. What is possible? It is not in terms of their thoughts, getting these solutions from them. They're not thinking in those directions. Their system is, let's just try to deal with the local market. But again, how long will you remain in terms of solutioning with respect to the local market? How sustainable can even the local market be? Because your capacities to scale is also very critical for your long-term sustenance. The larger your market, the stronger you are in terms of competing. So a lot of funds have been going in, a lot of startup raising, millions of dollars, unicorns have emerged, but how long are they going to last in terms of their runway? If they're just considering their local markets, what's the size of those economies to sustain those kinds of returns in the long term? And so the criticality of globalization, the criticality of global expansion in terms of their scaling of their innovation become very critical. So those are the kinds of questions that I want to begin to look at what pathways are possible in this respect.
We have one final question online. And the question asks, in what ways can the Otigba model begin a formalization process in a bid to scale up activities?
Okay, this again is where government institutional support becomes very critical. If you go to Otigba operators now and ask them, do you want to formalize? What's the incentive to formalize? Informal market operators don't really have a strong incentive again for formalization because they become more visible within the economic structures, taxation, issues around that. So from their own perspective, it's not critical. But again, for their long-term sustenance, they will need the formal structures because it will be very important for their long-term solution in terms of attracting funds, in terms of attracting partnerships. A more structured system, even though it's not apparent to those operators, becomes much more critical. So the government at the moment is thinking of establishing a enterprise knowledge zone within Lagos, what they call KITE, Knowledge Innovation Technology Hub within Lagos. Are they going to merge these two? They are talking of moving them from their current locations, but in all these permutations, what kinds of models are possible, considering the dynamics are different with the two basic clusters? One, there's a strong effect of weak ties, and another one, there are strong ties. do we, in moving these markets, do they domicile them in one place? One is semi-formal, one is informal. That may help the formalization process. That may help integrating the pros and cons and balancing out for better outcomes. And so there are permutations all around, but nothing is definite. And those are some of the issues we'll look at as we drive the research forward.
Well, Raymond, thank you so much for this presentation and all the insights. Thank you so much for coming to the OII to present your work. I'll just ask those of us who are in the room to give a round of applause for Raymond. Thank you to all of you who are also listening online. And Raymond's email is on the screen if you would like to also connect with him. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you at the next OII event.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.